I'm the storyteller, and my stories must be told. I have many stories, tales for both the young and old. I have many voices to describe many places. Many names have I, and many faces. In Russia I am Ivan, in Sweden I am Jan. In Germany I'm Johann, in America I'm John. From my many travels I have gathered these tales to teach you good sense when all else fails. Sometimes there are tears, sometimes there is laughter, but always are happily ever after.
Long ago and far away, deep in the countryside, there lived two brothers called Yanko and Latsi. Yanko, the elder brother, lived in a fine house in a village overlooked by a steep, snowy mountain. With the money his father had left him, Yanko had prospered and become very wealthy, while poor Latsi lived in a tumble-down old house on the other side of the mountain. Through misfortune, Latsi had lost all his money, and now the only thing he and his wife possessed in abundance was children. At meal times there was very little food, and the children often went to bed crying and hungry, while Latsi and his wife often had nothing at all. One day, Latsi could stand the cries of his children no longer, so forgetting his pride, he set off up the cold, snowy hill for his brother's village. He had not seen Yanko for a year now, for he was a very busy man. But Latsi did so hope he would help. If not for his sake, at least for his children's. Poor Latsi had had such bad luck. His crops had failed, and he had been cheated at market. Now he had no money to buy seeds or animals, and though he worked from dawn till dusk, he still never made enough money to feed his family. When Latsi arrived at the village, he went straight to his brother's house. He felt very shy, for he had come without an invitation. And indeed, when he entered the house, he found his brother and wife at table. "Good day, brother," said Latsi shyly. "Good day, Latsi," he said. "What brings you here?" Latsi felt very embarrassed, and he did so hate to ask. "Forgive me, brother, but my family have eaten little for days. Could you spare me a few kopecks? I will repay you." "Brother," Yanko replied, "I'd like to help, but I'm short of money myself." And he looked slyly at Latsi. Did his brother know he was lying? But when Yanko saw how unhappy Latsi looked, even his hard heart was touched. He loved his roubles too much to part with them, but he went over to Latsi and said, "Tomorrow's my birthday, and I'm having a party. Please come, bring your wife, don't worry about your clothes." Then he embraced Latsi and watched him go, pleased that his friends would see how generous he was to his poor brother. Latsi's wife was waiting eagerly for him to return. But when Latsi told her that Yanko had no money to lend them, she was very upset. "Cheer up now," cried Latsi, "for he has invited us to his birthday party tomorrow, even though we have no fine clothes to wear." So that night, Latsi and his wife gave all the food to the children and went to bed, hungry but hopeful. The next morning, Latsie's wife dressed the children in their warmest clothes and set off from their house through the village. For a neighbour had kindly said she would look after the children so they would not be alone all day. Latsie and his wife said goodbye to the children, and off they went to Yanko's house. They were soon passed on the road by other guests in their fine carriages. Poor Latsie and his wife began to feel very nervous about meeting Yanko's grand friends. At Yanko's house, the table was spread with delicious plates of meat. Now, Latsie and his wife had been placed at the far end of the table, and though all the other guests were given great helpings of food, Latsie and his wife were quite forgotten by the servers and were much too shy to ask. Plate after plate of meat, fish and game were brought before the guests, who laughed and joked and stuffed themselves with food. Finally, Latsie grew so faint from the good smells that he timidly took a piece of dry bread for himself and his wife. Perhaps this would stop their stomachs from rumbling. How they longed to join in, but Yanko took no notice of them and seemed completely taken up with his fashionable friends. So Latsie and his wife just sat there like two timid mice until at last the meal was over. Yanko and his wife said goodbye to their guests. Latsie thanked them kindly for the meal. Yanko was very pleased. Hadn't he been generous to his brother? The guests departed in their carriages, laughing and singing, while Latsie and his wife trudged slowly home. Because they did not wish to let Yanko down, they tried to pretend that they'd had a wonderful time too, and they laughed and joked to each other. But it was no good. They could not keep it up for long. They both felt so cold, miserable and hungry as they trudged wearily down the steep hill. Oh, what were they going to do? They could not go on like this. Suddenly, Latsie's wife stopped. She could walk no further. "Come on, wife," cried Latsie. "I can't," cried his wife. "I'm too tired." "If you stop here, you'll freeze to death," cried Latsie. And he gave her an angry shove to make her move. He pushed over what he thought was a scarecrow, but it wasn't. It was the troublemaker, Sorrow. "Go away," cried Latsie. But he knew that once Sorrow came to stay, he did not leave. So Latsie stumbled off down the hill with his wife, and sure enough, Sorrow followed close behind. And Sorrow was still there when Latsie and his wife arrived home, tired and dispirited. When Sorrow entered the house, he went straight to the table and picked up a mug, for he was terribly thirsty, but it was empty. Latsie watched gloomily as Sorrow walked round the table looking in all the mugs. Sorrow was very disappointed that Latsie had no drink in the house. He would have to do something about this. They would just have to sell something. Then with the money they could go to the tavern. That was it, thought Sorrow. They could sell Latsie's fur coat. Poor Latsie did not want to part with his coat, but there was no arguing with Sorrow, so he reluctantly gave it to him. Sorrow was delighted, and off he went. Latsie quickly decided that if he was nice to Sorrow, he might go away, so he followed him off to the tavern. Sorrow decided to sell his coat too, so they could buy more vodka. So Latsie took both their coats and offered them to the innkeeper. The innkeeper knew how poor Latsie was and only offered him 1 kopeck. But Latsie wanted more, so the innkeeper finally gave him 2 kopecks, with which he bought vodka for Sorrow. Sorrow was waiting eagerly. Latsy smiled as he gave him the drink, for he did so hope that if Sorrow drank all he wanted, he might fall asleep and leave him in peace. Sorrow demanded more and more vodka and drank down every drop. Early the next morning, while Latsy was still sleeping, Sorrow came to his bedside. He was thirsty and wanted something to drink. Poor Latsy pleaded that he had no more money, but Sorrow would not listen, and he just threw back the covers and pulled poor Latsy from his bed. Latsy's wife was preparing potato soup in the kitchen when Sorrow came in. The moment he saw the ring on her finger, he knew he could sell it for vodka. Yes, he could buy a few drinks with that, he thought gleefully. And why not sell Latsy's hat? It must be worth a kopeck or two. But Latsy did not want to part with his hat. And when Sorrow showed him his wife's ring, Latsy was very upset. But what could he do? It was just impossible to say no to Sorrow. Sorrow went straight to the tavern and sold the ring to the innkeeper. He bought jar after jar of vodka, which he drank one after the other, while Latsy watched and wondered if his troubles would ever end. And so it continued, day after day, that Sorrow sold everything in Latsy's house, down to the last mug and spoon, and spent it all on vodka. Then the morning came, when Sorrow asked Latsy to take him to the tavern, and Latsy said, "I can't, Sorrow, for you've sold everything I own." "Then ask your neighbour for his cart," cried Sorrow. So with a heavy heart, Latsy did what Sorrow asked, for he knew there would be no peace until he did. Sorrow led Latsy up into the hills, and whenever Latsy grew tired of hauling the heavy cart, Sorrow would urge him to hurry on, saying he had something very special to show him. Sorrow led him on down among the rocks. Latsy was very fearful. Why was Sorrow bringing him out here to this lonely place? His life before meeting Sorrow had been difficult, but now it was a nightmare. Would he ever wake up? What was he doing here with his neighbour's cart? But whenever he asked, Sorrow just urged him on. At last, they stopped. Sorrow showed Latsy a rock, which seemed to be blocking the entrance to a cave. Sorrow tugged at the rock, and at first it hardly moved. But slowly, as he pulled, it came away. And there, inside the cave, was revealed a great pile of gleaming gold. Latsy was spellbound. Never in his whole life had he seen one gold coin, and here there must be hundreds and hundreds. "Stop gawping," cried Sorrow. "Hurry up and load the gold." Latsy gently picked up a handful of the coins, but Sorrow was impatient and told him to put them in the cart quickly. So Latsy took up the shovel and began to load the gold into the cart. He kept thinking how he could feed his hungry children with the gold, but how instead Sorrow would just drink it all away at the tavern. Shovel after shovel he brought out, until at last the cart was brimming with gold coins. Latsy knew he must do something now, or he would never free himself from Sorrow. So he hurried back to the cave, and beckoning Sorrow to come closer, he said, "Please look and see if I have left any coins. I'm so tired. Wait, isn't that something gleaming in the corner?" Now Sorrow was so greedy he couldn't bear to leave one single coin, so he crept into the cave. And the moment that he did, Lutzi moved forward, and pulling the rock with all his strength, he managed to push it over the mouth of the cave. "Let me out!" cried Sorrow. "Let me out of here!" But Lutzi had no intention of letting him out. Sorrow was much too expensive a guest. So away went Lutzi, pulling the cart full of gold, while Sorrow shouted from the cave. At last he arrived home. His wife, seeing him alone, came over. She wondered what had happened to Sorrow. She was filled with wonder when she saw the gold, and when Lutzi told her what had happened. So with the gold, Lutzi took his family away from the cold, draughty house and bought a fine new one in the centre of the village. For the first time in their lives, his children had good food and plenty of it. No longer did they go to bed crying from hunger. News of Lutzi's good fortune travelled fast, and Janko soon came to hear of it. He was so curious that he decided to pay his brother a visit. When he saw what a fine house Lutzi had, Janko felt very irritated. He just didn't understand how his brother had done so well. When Janko entered, he found his brother and family at table. Lutzi was very pleased to see Janko and invited him in. "Come, sit down with us, brother," he cried. "Join us in our good fortune." Janko was so curious he could not resist asking, "Lutzi, tell me how you came by such wealth, for now you are much richer than I." So Lutzi told his brother all about Sorrow, how he had met him on the road, how he came to stay, and how he had reduced them to utter poverty because of his drinking. Then he told Janko about the cave of gold and how he had trapped Sorrow there. "Now he is somewhere where he can do no harm," smiled Lutzi, "and all my worries are over." But Janko, instead of being pleased by his brother's fortune, was very jealous. He did not like his brother being richer than himself, so as he walked home, he decided to try and find the cave where Sorrow was kept prisoner. "If I release him," thought Janko, "then he will take all Lutzi's gold away and give it to me." At last he came to the rocks where the cave was. Quickly he ran up to it, and making sure there was no one about, Janko slowly pulled back the rock. And who should run out of the cave but Sorrow? He was in a terrible rage, and with a scream he jumped straight onto Janko's back. Janko tried to explain to Sorrow that it was his brother who had tricked him out of his gold. Sorrow would not listen, so Janko returned home with Sorrow clinging tightly to his back. Months passed, and Sorrow was soon drinking away Janko's fortune. It was impossible for Janko to deny Sorrow anything. Janko soon realized that if he did not do something, he would soon be reduced to the poverty his brother had once known. He had to do something, and quickly. So one morning, as Janko was out in the yard, desperately trying to think of some way to rid himself of the dreadful Sorrow, he happened to glance round when he caught sight of a wooden barrel. Janko quickly went over to it, Yes, that might do just the trick. And he hurried back to the house to find Sorrow. He found him lying half asleep on his bed. "Come on, Sorrow," smiled Yanko. "Let's have a game of hide-and-seek before the tavern opens." "What a good idea," smiled Sorrow, for he was feeling very bored. And with that, he jumped up and ran straight out into the yard. Yanko quickly followed Sorrow out. There were so many wonderful places to hide in the yard, but first they had to decide who should hide and who should seek. So they counted for it, and Yanko won. Sorrow hid his eyes, and Yanko looked about for somewhere to hide. Then he saw the haystack. Yes, that was it. Yanko crouched down behind the haystack and waited for Sorrow to stop counting and open his eyes. When he did, he had no trouble finding Yanko. He went straight to the haystack, and there he was. Now it was Sorrow's turn to hide. "Bet you can't get in that barrel," cried Yanko. "Bet you I can," grinned Sorrow. And the moment Yanko's back was turned, Sorrow jumped straight in. In a flash, Yanko had the lid, and he banged it down on top. Sorrow cried, furious, but Yanko had no intention of releasing his unwelcome guest. Instead, he rolled the barrel down the river bank while Sorrow banged and shouted. Yanko gave the barrel a mighty push, and down it rolled into the river, where it was soon bobbing away downstream. Yanko watched, very relieved. He had learned his lesson most surely. He would never meddle with Sorrow again. A few days later, a peasant found the barrel on the riverside. Full of curiosity, he released Sorrow and lived to rue the day. Sorrow never troubled Yanko or Latzi again. Yanko worked hard and earned back the fortune he had lost through his envy. Latzi and his family lived on together very happily in their new home. The children were now full of laughter, and they never went hungry again.